Greetings, Unhidden Voices family. Happy Black History Month. I'm so excited for this episode. This is the last in our Look to the Artist series, and we bring together Ominira Mars and Nalya Rodriguez. The three of us are collaborating on a piece to seek justice for Breonna Taylor by looking at how her image was appropriated on social media. In addition, we talk about what it means to be scholar activists and to use our writing and our platform for public consumption. And so I think you'll learn a lot from this episode. I think you'll enjoy it. And we hope that you will subscribe to our podcast and follow us here on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, and follow us on Facebook, and continue to listen, learn, and amplify with us. All right, yay, woohoo, we're here. All right, so welcome. I'm so excited for my two amazing, brilliant, special guests. And each of them will introduce themselves, but I have to say that we just discovered that Nalya and I have known each other for almost a decade, so I'm aging them right now. I'm not aging myself, but I'm aging them. But when we met, they became an intern on and helping me to look at my dissertation research at initially at when I was still finalizing my dissertation at UC Berkeley, and then we began collaborating together on a piece that I now use in several of my courses called #Sandra Bland's Mystery, a transmedia story of police brutality, which talks about how Sandra Bland's story of her death was told on Facebook and Twitter. And it took us so many revisions to get that published, but it was recently published in 2019 in an edited volume of a book called #Identity, along with authors, so many very brilliant authors. A lot of them are colleagues and just specialists in the field. And one of my mentors, Dr. Gail DeKosnick and Dr. Keith Feldman, both of them were the co-editors of that text, and both of them are just amazing scholars. So that is Nalya. And then Omi, has it only been has it been a year and a half, 2 years?
I think has it been a year?
It feels like
a year right now. I don't know.
It feels like I've known you forever.
We met in August 2019.
We met in August, and it's so funny because I will never forget this, because I was about to teach this class on African American educational thought in education, and Omi had not signed up for the class. So they approached me when I was walking up the steep hill in San Francisco, and they were like, "Can I please add your class?" And I was like, oh, we talked, and I was like, "Of course." So they added. And then we began to just develop a rapport and a mentorship relationship. And both of these young folks are just such brilliant scholars and brilliant emerging scholars in the field. And both of them, I'm so excited about this opportunity because I invited them both to co-author with me. And I also really love bringing brilliant people together. So it was just such a wonderful opportunity. So that being said, I also want to say, if you like this episode, please subscribe and hit the notification button so you can hear more and learn more about our work and what we're doing. And then I'm going to ask Nalya to do more of an introduction and talk about your work and what you're studying right now. And then we'll let Omi introduce themselves.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Oh my God, I feel so old and I'm all hot now. But yeah, so I'm a PhD student at UC Irvine right now in sociology. My research has mostly focused on El Salvador, but I've started to expand. So currently working on Central American broad research, doing quantitative research on gang violence and policy opinions, perceptions in Central America. My work outside of school has has also mostly focused on gangs, mass incarceration, and specifically been organizing within Central American communities. But lately, I don't know, for like the last couple years, I've been doing more coalition building in LA and Orange County, around like issues of incarceration, prisoner rights, and yeah, like a lot of mutual aid work, especially out of COVID. A lot of my work in the past year has focused on setting up mutual aid networks in LA and Orange County, and providing resources for folks coming out of prison.
So very important work. And let's talk about, I'm going to ask you to make a connection between the work that you're doing and the interest you have in police brutality. But I'll do that next after after they introduce themselves. And then I'd like you both to answer that question.
My name is Omi. I am very Southern, very Black, very queer. I'm from Georgia, but I moved to the Bay, and I'm a master's student at the University of San Francisco. And yeah, right now I'm also the communications manager at the Abolitionist Teaching Network. Before I started my graduate studies, I was an organizer who mainly showed up to movement work through a communications capacity. So I'm passionate about strategic narratives and how narrative work is really important to movement work, and in tearing down and confronting systems of oppression. So I'm passionate about building counter narratives as well. Yeah, that's mainly my work right now. I love writing. I'm also a creative writer. I've taught creative writing in the past with the Oakland Summer School and other community education organizations around Oakland and the Bay. And yeah, my research right now is I'm mainly looking into how Black people function as fugitives in education. So I'm looking at Black fugitivity in education, and neo-Maroonage, and how Black educators are resisting education as a site of incarceration.
Okay, so you use some terms that I don't know if everyone might be familiar with. So can you explain what Black fugitivity is and what neo-Maroonage is?
So Black fugitivity in the most simplest terms is just, it's mainly used in sociological terms, but I'm mostly interested in linking it to the educational field, and it mostly just describe Black people as, how can I put this? As like people escaping oppressive systems and multiple sites of incarceration. So fugitives are mainly described as people who are on the run. So in essence, Black people are on the run from harmful education policies and educational institutions. And Maroons were described in the past as escaped slaves who successfully ran away and built small communities that were kind of actually centered around mutual aid. So before mutual aid was a thing, Black escaped and slaves and runaways were, building these communes to take care of one another and to create sovereignty.
And so for those listening or watching this podcast episode, you can tell just from their introductions just how, brilliant they are, and also the importance of the work that they do. And I feel very blessed to be in company with them and to be in support of them in their scholarship. And so I'm really, really excited about continuing that collaboration and ongoing. And also we pushed each other's thinking, and I've learned a lot from both of you since we've been, working together. And so I'd like for Nalya, for you to begin to talk about the connection between the work that you do and your interests and thinking about police brutality, and specifically against gender-based police brutality inflicted on the cases of our research Black women.
Yeah, so when I started doing dissertation work, I didn't really know exactly how I was going to like focus on my project. And it was like, it's been pretty surprising and shocking to see how much of the work that you and I did together in my early stages of research is like now the way that I'm like going for the dissertation. So that's been like really awesome. And so how that's playing out is my dissertation has focused on looking at the socio-legal constructions of Salvadorans as terrorists. That very much is intertwined with the ways in like who is mostly impacted by these policies that literally create terror objects, terror people, right? Terrorists. And the way that it's been coming out in my work is one is like the media narratives, right? Like the creation of threats through the media. Looking at the objects that are racialized in these narratives that create threat narratives that link certain groups of people to being like threats. And the other issue is like, well, who does this impact most? And part of these policies are often justified in the terrorism context, are often justified as like protecting women and children. But what we've been seeing in the Central American context is that women and children are being incarcerated in these detention centers, these detention camps, because of these policies without any actual basis for like designation of threat. And actually like Central American and Black women and children are more likely to be considered threats in the immigration context than other immigrants from other places. So in that sense, like it's very much been intertwined with my dissertation work, but also like doing this media research with you all has also been informing the ways in which I come to understand how certain narratives are discussed on different platforms, right? The narratives that get discussed on social media tend to like, there's more of a checks and balances, I think, on Twitter, for example, than in mainstream media, news articles, like print media, which is what I'm looking at for my dissertation.
Oops, absolutely right. So true. And that was something that we definitely uncovered in our research of Sandra Bland. And again, that piece is called #Sandra Bland's Mystery. It's actually available open source. So if you haven't read it, you can access it open source. You can access the entire text, #identity. And it's just it's really important work. And so, Omi, can you please share how our work is connected to your work?
Just wanted to say that I love that this article is available open source. Yeah, so as far as the intersectionality of police brutality and how that's connected to my work, when I started researching, I think I picked up on a lot of the same observations that Nalya did. And I love what she said about this checks and balances that happens on like Twitter versus like print media, which is like absolutely true. And so I think there's been a major, in my opinion, there's been a major like mass re-education happening in the past few years through social media. And so I'm definitely interested in like community and informal education, and informal education has been happening on drastic levels through Instagram, through Twitter. And I think that's because most of the young people and most of the people who don't really have access to higher education are doing their research and they're gathering in these places and they're having these conversations. And what's happening is they're creating discursive shifts on social media about police brutality. And so there has, what I've been seeing in my research is that this discursive shift has been happening because people are dedicated to educating not just themselves, but one another. And I think that definitely relates to my work because looking at Black people as like quote unquote educational maroons, when these discursive shifts aren't happening in higher education, when they aren't happening in the classroom, people are flocking to what's the word I'm looking for? They're flocking to sites, and they're flocking to other mediums, where they feel like their voices and their interpretations of these conceptual topics can be heard. And so yeah, we see that happening on social media. And so as far as like police brutality as it relates to Black women, intersectionality may have been a term that was kind of sort of created through scholarly and academic work, but it's like the people are taking that and they're applying it to their daily lives and to the way they interpret real life events that are happening in real time, and they're having these conversations on social media. And I think it's an absolutely beautiful thing that's happening. And again, speaking on police brutality in relation to Black women and how people are interpreting the intersectionality of police violence. Not saying that this discursive shift isn't happening in higher education, but the rate at which is happening on social media is just like, I'm gonna make this infographic. You're gonna learn about this today, and I'm going to speak from a place that makes me the expert, because either I'm a Black woman or I have Black women in my life. And so I'm going to use my narrative to not just speak. I'm not just using, my title as a professor or a scholar to speak. I'm using my narrative, my own personal narrative, to speak to what's happening with Black women and police brutality. And I think people are willing to go to quote unquote the bottom of the barrel to talk about these topics. And it's a beautiful thing to actually see.
One of the things I also wanted to shout out, which I hadn't done before when I introduced you, Omi, is our work on the centering Black women in Black women teachers in education and research, and looking at the contributions of Black women. And one of the things that we've been doing is specifically thinking about the contributions of Black women to intellectual thought and education, right? And so I think that idea and that concept what we're uncovering is that when we think about intellectual thought through a Black perspective, it is not just the ideas that we come up with, but it's also in relation to power, and it's also in relation to our experiences with power. So that's the concept, that's the idea, and that's what we are coming to understand. And so then if we think about that and how that plays out on social media, it becomes this opportunity for entry points from different perspectives into either a convergence or a divergence of ideas, right? And so that is something that Nalya and I were able to uncover in our initial research on Sandra Bland, was that people weren't actually coming together. The ideas and the narrative was not able to be sustained. And this is why we termed it a mystery, because even though initially the African American Policy Forum was saying, Sandra Bland was a unique victim and she was criminalized, and her murder was a result of the fact that she was a Black woman, that necessarily was not agreed upon by all the people who chose to tell her story on social media, right? And so I was actually invited to submit a chapter in an anthology that is going to look at the history of police brutality in the United States. And the chapter I was invited to write was specifically looking at the impact of gender on police brutality. And they cited our piece as the reason why they wanted me to write and author this other piece. And so I was like, okay, I need to hit up my, co-author to write the secondary piece. And then obviously also Omi and I had continued. So they took a class with me last fall and this past fall. And this past fall, Omi wrote a really powerful piece, which I posted on the Unhidden Voices Medium site, which she challenges uh, cultural appropriation of Black identity by a white woman professor. And the piece is very powerful. It's actually gone pretty viral. And if you haven't read it yet, just please go to Unhidden Voices on Medium and read it, because I'm pretty positive you will find it as powerful as I did. But that was one of the places where I saw not only that you are, and you did a voice that you love writing, but it's also the ways in which your intellect conceives of and conceptualizes different ideas around race and identity, and the ways in which you're able to voice that I felt would make this a very powerful contribution to our writing team. Right. And so I'm very grateful to both of you for the thinking that you provide in this moment. So what we decided was that we weren't going to do a broader sort of look at Black women and police brutality, but that we were in this moment that we're in now, where Breonna Taylor is the focal representation of a Black woman who was a victim of police brutality, who was murdered in her sleep, and that the criminalization of her partner is the reason that justified her murder, right, by police. And so we decided to then do that investigation and to look at different streams of kind of the storyline of Breonna Taylor. So I'd like each of you to kind of talk about the area that you're looking at in terms of investigating Breonna Taylor's murder and how it's conceived on social media and what platforms and what you're finding. So let's start with you, Nalya.
Yeah, so I've been looking at the Twitter data that discusses Breonna Taylor and her ex-boyfriend. And what I think that part of what we're seeing, well, one is that is the ex-boyfriend and then the boyfriend at the time of her murder, Kenneth Walker. And what I've seen a lot of is a lot of conversations and that Kenneth Walker has been having that really is uplifting Breonna's story. And then a lot of the conversations around the ex-boyfriend, who was the person that the police were looking for, that was on the warrant. A lot of those conversations have tried to shift the narrative away from him and back to the fact that what we need to be talking about is the fact that this person was killed, right? This Black woman was killed for no fault of her own and in her home. And so for me, one of the things that's interesting is to kind of see how the narratives on Twitter have changed over time. I feel like a lot of the narrative on Twitter right now is really correcting. It's more checks and balances than it was in the Sandra Bland case. And it doesn't seem like a mystery. It seems very clear in this situation. The murder of Breonna Taylor seems very clear. And I feel like people are more quick to correct the narrative and to challenge people that try to provide counter narratives that are based on like non-factual information, right? Trying to criminalize her or her boyfriend at the time, Kenneth Walker. So in that sense, it's been interesting to see, and I would be curious to know how much of the Say Her Name campaign has contributed in kind of pushing for more of this like checks and balances on social media.
Absolutely right. And so we can also identify that we wrote that piece 5 years ago, right? We initiated that story. Sandra Bland was murdered in 2015, and we began the research on that year, like after she was murdered or found dead. She was found dead. And so then subsequently, and now it's 2021, so 6 years later. And but obviously Breonna Taylor was murdered, in 2020, right? And so so I have two questions for you, Omi, because I think part of definitely am interested in what you're uncovering in as you look into the aspect of the narrative that you're looking at, but also the idea of appropriation, because as I mentioned before, this is something that you have been thinking about, and this is something that you have been writing about how someone's image can be culturally appropriated by someone else. And that was what the other piece that you wrote for the blog goes about. So can you talk about that too? And like, how has Breonna Taylor's image been co-opted and culturally appropriated?
Yeah, I on Breonna Taylor's image and the appropriation of her death. So Breonna Taylor was murdered in March, and during March and April, the data that I'm finding on Twitter, there are barely any tweets. So there are tweets, but compared to the tweets in May, which is around the time George Floyd had died, there was a like massive increase in the amount of tweets. And I think that the advocates for Breonna Taylor saw an opportunity to kind of sort of attach the awareness of Breonna Taylor's death to the awareness and the virality of George Floyd's death. And so as far as like the misappropriation of how people are bringing awareness to Breonna Taylor's death, there was also a lot of concern that was raised on social media sometime around September of 2020 around the way Breonna Taylor's image was being used for like TikTok challenges, the way people were using her photo to kind of sort of raise awareness for their own events that had nothing to do with raising awareness for police brutality. And I think that this is a great, I think through this research, I've been thinking a lot about what it means, how co-conspiratorship and allyship shows up on social media. And so I think there needs to be some sort of guide to folks who are allies and co-conspirators in the movement towards Black liberation, and on how one can appropriately bring awareness to the death of a Black person. So are you consistently resharing Black death in the way that psychologically tortures Black folks online? Are you misappropriating the image by doing a TikTok challenge? And what does that mean for you as an ally or co-conspirator? And how can you like effectively and more ethically share the and bring awareness to the death of Breonna Taylor without misappropriating her image, without consistently sharing horrific details that may trigger emotions out of Black people on your timeline? So through my research, I've been, raising that question to myself, like, how would that look? Could there be a guide for that? Because we talk a lot about how co-conspiratorship and allyship exists offline and non-virtually, but how can we talk about, co-conspiratorship virtually and what that looks like?
I was just having a conversation with a dear friend yesterday, and I was talking about the ways in which folks. So essentially, and I'm speaking from my own experience with, now that I have become more of a public sort of a scholar activist, say, and using social media as a means to promote ideas around that support as a contribution for the movement for Black lives. And so, through this podcast that we are a part of, doing this episode, and through the writings and things that we're doing, the scholarship that we're doing that specifically pointed towards that, but then also doing public scholarship. So this is public scholarship, right? This is what this podcast is. And then also in the writing on converting something that might be a very intellectual idea to being something that's consumable by people who may not be in the academy is really important, right? But as a result of that, then what ends up happening is if you put it in, if you share it via social media, via tweet or what have you, or on Facebook, and we haven't talked that much about Facebook. So we have noticed in our previous research that Facebook is a place where people wind up being much more, they spend a lot more time, their posts are much longer, but they also spend a lot of time derailing messages, being very counter, being, just inappropriate, and not, also not being able to, or not asserting like allyship or co-conspiratorship in that space. And what we named the folks that we would consider allies is resolvers, right? That was the term that we came up with in the Sandra Bland piece. But one of the things that I noticed was, and this is just a sort of a question or idea about that connects to what Omi just was talking about, was that, like, if we put out something and folks are contrarian or derailing that message, and then how much responsibility is it on the initial messenger to, put forth a clarification, on how much is on the community, right? To voice, this is inappropriate, this is a derailer, how much is happening, or to give voice and name to, this is an appropriation, this is what we're noticing at this moment. So and the example that comes to mind right now is what I was talking to my friend about was, I wrote this piece where I was asking Kamala Harris to be more like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? And I was like, and it was as a result of something that Kamala Harris said, where she said that it was audacious for Joe Biden to pick her because she's a Black woman. And I found that insulting, right? And I was like, Fannie Lou Hamer was audacious. And I named that, and I was like, be more like her, and don't center our Blackness in a way to kind of say is like, it's, we're not worthy, thank you, white man, for picking me, or whatever. So that was the piece that I wrote. And so and then someone on social media, a white woman named Cotton, of all things, besides like all of the trolls that I get are like, hella, it'll be like such and such crusader, and and Cotton, and I'm like, you out your cotton picking mind right now. But anyway, Cotton said something to the effect of like telling me that I need to read. They were just white splaining, like telling me, well, you don't know, basically down, dogging Kamala Harris, and then saying, she could never be Fannie Lou Hamer. And by you saying that, it's just because you have no idea who Fannie Lou Hamer is. And so, yeah, a white woman told me that I don't know who Fannie Lou Hamer is on social media. Bruh. It killed me. I was just like, oh, do I respond to this? But then I said no, because I had already done my, my piece was my contribution. And I said, the community now needs to respond to this. And so that to me is the answer, I think, to what you're saying, Omi. But I want to send it back to you to say, what do you think is the responsibility in that case of like the community to address the folks that are there to derail the message, and how do we, or to, co-opt or to appropriate, folks' ideas and thinking, and what is the responsibility, and how should that be done on across these platforms?
I am so sorry for that that Cotton person. That's absolutely atrocious. I'm gonna piggyback off of the way you responded to that person. I think that it is a communal manner. I think it's a communal responsibility as far as like what it means to confront the misappropriation of the way that Black intellectual thought is being shared online, or for instance, the misappropriation of Breonna Taylor's death through like TikTok challenges. And the response that I did see, where it was more of a communal response to the misappropriation of her death and the use of her image. And people started to have discourse around how to more like effectively raise awareness without doing that. And I saw a lot of Black Instagram influencers bringing up this conversation, which was a beautiful thing to see. And they were inviting allies or co-conspirators into the conversation, being like, you know, if you want to talk about this in my DMs, we could talk about this. Or, you know, they're going on live, they're having this conversation. So I do think that it should be a communal response, because the truth is a lot of us don't have a lot of Black scholars and Black thinkers when we go to platforms like social media to share a message. We don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the capacity. And I think it's very lovely to see they call it Black Twitter, band together. Like band together and say, absolutely not. You will not bully this person today. You will, you know, so I think that's a whole nother study within itself to see how like Black people function online. But yeah, I think it should definitely be a communal response. And some things just don't deserve a response. We don't have to consistently, as non-white folks, we don't have to consistently explain ourselves, especially on social. If I'm not going to do it in the classroom, I'm not going to do it online. I'm gonna send you a resource. I'm gonna tag something that you could follow if I don't have the bandwidth, but you know, that's just my opinion.
No, I get that. I agree. I totally support that. And I love that. Like, yeah, just read this. Bye. But okay, Nalya, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. And I feel like I've definitely seen more of that recently, like in the last year. People coming, especially on Instagram, is where I've seen it happen a lot more, where people will share content from other pages that, especially like content from Black queer people on Instagram, that put disclaimers, right? Because a lot of like artists aren't paid for a lot of what they're putting out and on social media. And so it's like, how can you share these like infographics, this information on something like colorism, for example, putting someone else's labor on your page without even one, giving them credit, and two, like paying them? Because like that's like another aspect too, right? But I've seen that a lot on Instagram, more so, where like people, community members coming to bat, being like, well, you need to tag this person at the very minimum, first of all. Second of all, you should take this down, because if you haven't seen what they've posted, they said don't share their stuff, right? And so like I've seen that a lot more on Instagram than on other platforms. And I definitely think that it's up to the community to really bring the conversation back to center the message that was originally put out.
Yeah, no, I think I had a conversation actually with my brother, because I noticed, and this is when I made this decision, and also with my team that, you know, helps me. Shout out to Sadiq, Taz, and Rita with this podcast, because very recently somebody, and it wasn't like a death threat, but it was like, it's close that I've come to one, you know, and in a response and a comment. And I was saying, you know, as my manager, and this is something on me that you can speak to as a person that's a communications person, that as a social media manager, that I see that as your role to make sure that I don't, you know, as the content creator, have to read anything where it's like somebody's saying, you know, something like trying to threaten my life or whatever. And then we had this conversation, and they were like, well, you know, it's going to get to a point ideally where, you know, it's just going to be really huge, and there's going to be lots of comments, and then you're not going to be able to manage that. Right. And I was like, yeah, well, we're not there yet. But I was like, you know, we're just inching, you know, like, you know, above it. And I was like, but the other thing is, I think it's a difference between, you know, having a communal response to something where you know, give and take, right? You put out your thoughts and then people might disagree, and you can have that debate or discussion and what have you, and it's on an intellectual level, and it's like a push and pull for learning versus something that's outright just white supremacist hate, you know. And also something that's harmful, like the co-opting or taking people's work, you know, their intellectual and artistic property, and using it for your own benefit. That is a harm, right? And so then the question then becomes about like the management of it, right? Like how do we manage these processes in such a way that we allow for a distinction to be made, right, in terms of, you know, where the line is drawn, and then also secondarily, who's responsible for, you know, for managing and ensuring that that harm is not like continually replicated on the social platforms.
Sorry, I just realized I wasn't muted. You probably heard cars driving by. In response to that, I really love that question that you bring up about, like, you know, when does it become like manageable, and when is there a hard boundary to where it's like absolutely not. And that's such a hard conversation, even like bringing this back to the whole conversation on Breonna Taylor's raising awareness for what happened to Breonna Taylor. I'm pretty sure the family had many conversations about how this would play out, like in their attempt to raise awareness about their daughter's death. They knew that, I'm pretty sure that they knew that social media would be the perfect medium to hold these cops and to hold the PD department, to hold the state accountable to what happened to their family member. And I'm pretty sure that they had to think about like balancing that out. And I'm thinking about the way that like the way we have to kind of sort of in approaching social media as a platform, because a lot of these social media algorithms and a lot of social media sites don't protect non-white supremacist folks. We've seen that with Instagram. And so I'm thinking a lot of non-white folks have to negotiate with themselves the way they show up, and it's so sad, but sometimes I find that a lot of non-white folks have to sacrifice their own like safety, some parts of their safety in a sense, when they want to share a message. And so me personally, I have a fear of being hyper visible on social media, because I know that the way I function online as a Black person, when I go online, the way I'm dehumanized off social media, when that doesn't change when I go online. I don't magically become, unless I'm anonymous. And then that's a whole nother conversation. Well, should I be anonymous? Because then will I have some sort of validity around my message if I'm not anonymous, versus if people can see that I am a Black dark-skinned person. And so it's just all of these negotiations happening, and I'm pretty sure that the family members of Breonna Taylor often think about these negotiations when it comes to raising awareness on their family members' death. And it's really sad to think about the way that non-white folks function online, and how we're not protected by these corporations, because that's what, you know, these social media sites are. They're mega corporations that kind of, and I remember having this conversation in the human rights and media class I took with you, Dr. Norris, around data rights as human rights. And so that's a whole other conversation. We're going to keep the conversation here.
Yeah, no, but I do think it's important to conceive. But first of all, I want to challenge the term non-white, and saying that we're all these different races, ethnicities, but then it makes white the dominant, and then we're all just not that. So I prefer like not to use that terminology because of that. And and also like one of the things that I'm also pressing for and naming is, and I really appreciate that. And I use the term Black because it also is more inclusive than saying like African American, right? Which a lot of folks that identify as Black do not identify as African American. So in keeping with that, though, I do think that it is a question of how the harm, again, getting back to this, the harm that being able to speak to, the larger issue of police brutality as opposed to like the racism that we might experience online when we are just, because of our identity, right? Which I think that Omi is talking about. And so have you found that, that folks whose responses are you seeing a lot of folks of different across race and ethnicity responding to these posts or posting about Breonna Taylor? And Nalya, would you take that? And then Omi?
Yeah, I've definitely seen people of different backgrounds posting about Breonna Taylor, but also I have also seen tweets that have tried to, because part of the ones I'm looking at are the ones that are talking about the ex-boyfriend and the current boyfriend, or like the boyfriend at the time of death. And so I have seen some tweets that have tried to justify her death because of the connections to the ex-boyfriend, whose connections to illicit activities has like now justified his criminalization. And so I have seen that a little bit, but I still have also seen in like pairing that with people correcting that narrative, like, well, that's not even her though, he wasn't even living there, like why is that even relevant? So yeah, so I have seen people from different backgrounds, but also like it would be interesting, I do think it would be interesting to see like the African American Policy Forum say her name like toolkit, but for these, like for allies, right? So what would it be like to have a toolkit that talks about how people derail conversations, how to recenter the original message from the messengers, right? How do we engage or disengage with derailers, right? Like, are there alternative ways than just reporting? Because we know like the reporting of a tweet or a post on Facebook, one, like community standards are hella racist. And a lot of times like these reports don't even go like farther than just a review, if that. And so what would it look like to find alternative ways to recentering original messages?
Omi, do you have a response to that question?
I really love what Nalia said about this, like this toolkit about recentering, because that's what, like as a comms manager, whenever I'm telling someone how to like function in an interview with, if say like I'm talking to an organizer and they're being interviewed by a radio station or a local newspaper, and this person may not agree with the work that we do or our message, so they're like they're purposely trying to decenter the message and focus on other attributes of character, or different things like that. And so the training is always around like how to recenter the message, how to bring the conversation back to what we came here to talk about. And I think it would be awesome if there was some sort of toolkit that explained to folks how to do that, to like Black folks, to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, how to like recenter the message. Because what I do see is that the discourse that's happening online, it's always back and forth, and the derailer has been successful at that back and forth because that's literally what that's what they're wanting. They're like getting fed off of this. They're hyped. They're like, yeah, like I'm wasting your time and you're allowing me to waste your time. And so Yeah, the way I function online when I'm having discourse on my Twitter is I'm consistently recentering the message. So I could say, I could be like justice for Breonna Taylor, and they could be like, well, did you know Breonna Taylor's boyfriend did this? And I would literally retweet the same thing. I'm just like, justice for Breonna Taylor. Arrest the cops that killed me. I will say the same thing, and then they will eventually leave my mentions.
I love that. So I think what I'm hearing is that we're giving ourselves a charge of something that we have to write, right? So so if it's not, if Toni Morrison said that if there's a story that know needs to be told, then you need to tell it, right? You need to write that story. So and obviously you're both speaking to expertise in this practice, right? So so that'll be coming soon. I want to just offer up, this final question, which is like, what are you finding in the research right now that is most exciting to you, and what are you looking most forward to in terms of writing up this, this story of Breonna Taylor and how her death was told on social media? Nalya.
All right, I can go. Well, I think like for me, the most exciting part is seeing the change over time. There has been increased visibility of Black women who have been victims of police violence, right? Like that has increased in the last 5-6 years. So that has been exciting, but also it's been really interesting to think about how people are pairing, right? And this is some of the data that Omi is looking at, how people are pairing these narratives with other experiences of police violence towards Black men, but also even like internationally, right? Like Breonna Taylor's story has gone all over the world. So seeing that more like global awareness of the violence experienced by Black women and men in the US, police violence specifically, is really exciting to see, especially, yeah, like the global context is really exciting for me.
Yeah, Piggy, going off of what Nalya said, what's been exciting for me is seeing the change over time, seeing that connection between like the global context of police brutality on like those on the margins. And personally for me, what's been exciting about the research and what I'm excited to get from it is this idea of like inner conversations happening. And so I do remember when Sandra Bland died, and people are still talking about that. But I see with Breonna Taylor is that like there's so many, like it's people are still talking at like a massive level, and it may be because of what's happening politically right now in this country. But people are still talking. People are still using hashtags, and people are not willing to rest about gaining justice for Breonna Taylor. And so that's exciting for me, and I'm excited to see how this inner conversation plays out between Black men and Black women and Black queer folks around gender and police brutality.
Absolutely. It's such a promising exploration, right? And I think that what we're uncovering is that there's learning that's happening over time. And it reminds me of something that we uncovered in the Human Rights in the Media course, where some of the students were actually looking at human rights youth activism in China. And they were looking at, the youth response very beginning when they were protesting against the government, and they were being tear gassed by the police, and they didn't really know how to respond. So they start off like with an umbrella, and then so on and so. And then over time, they get to the part where they can dismantle like the tear gas in like 30 seconds, like, you know, like a tear, like and so, you know, this is what we're seeing. Like, we're seeing that we are able to, over time now, learn how to respond to, you know, derailers online, and to be able to be persistent with the message of, you know, addressing police brutality and calling for justice for black victims, black and brown victims of police brutality, and specifically Black women, and Breonna Taylor in this case. So this is really, really very powerful, and I'm very grateful to both of you. Thank you so much for coming and joining us on this podcast. Just such a wonderful opportunity. Thank you for agreeing to co-author with me, and just for just your brilliance. It's just been just a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and I thank you and so much, very much appreciate both of you very, very much. Absolutely. So if you like this podcast, please subscribe, and then follow us at Unhidden Voices on Instagram, at Amina M on Twitter, and looking forward to having more conversations like this. Thank you. So wonderful. It's just absolutely such a wonderful. Thank you. I so appreciate your work.